There are moments in life that a person never forgets, not because they were the happiest or the most celebrated, but because they were the ones that quietly changed everything. For one ordinary person living an ordinary life, that moment came without any warning, without any grand announcement, and without any preparation. It arrived the way most life-changing things do, wrapped inside a regular Tuesday, hiding behind the noise of daily routine. His name was Daniel Carter, and at 34 years old, he had built a life that looked perfectly fine from the outside. He had a job that paid the bills, a small apartment on the east side of the city, and a handful of friends he would meet for dinner once in a while. To anyone watching, Daniel seemed steady, comfortable, content. But the truth was something different. The truth was that Daniel had been going through the same day over and over again for years, and somewhere along the way, he had stopped expecting anything different from life. He grew up in a mid-sized town in Ohio, the second of 3 children raised by a mother who worked double shifts at a hospital and a father who was present in body but rarely in spirit. His childhood was not filled with trauma in the dramatic sense, but it carried a quiet weight that shaped him in ways he would only understand much later. He learned early that asking for too much led to disappointment, and so he trained himself not to want beyond what seemed reasonable. He became a practical man in a world that often rewards practicality, and for a long time he told himself that was enough. He studied accounting in college, not because numbers excited him, but because someone once told him it was a stable career. He graduated, got a job at a mid-level firm, and moved to the city at 22 with 2 suitcases and a vague sense that something better was just around the corner. That corner never seemed to arrive. Years passed and Daniel kept working, kept paying rent, kept showing up. He was good at his job. His supervisors respected him. His clients trusted him, but inside there was a growing silence that he could never quite name or explain. He had been in one serious relationship in his late 20s with a woman named Priya, who was warm and intelligent and full of ambition. They dated for nearly 3 years, and for a while Daniel felt something close to alive again. But Priya wanted a partner who could match her energy, someone who could dream alongside her. And Daniel, try as he might, could not shake the invisible ceiling he had built inside his own mind. They parted on good terms, and both of them knew it was the right decision, but it left a mark on Daniel that took years to fade. By the time he was 34, Daniel had quietly accepted a version of life that was functional but hollow. He woke up at the same time every morning, made the same coffee, took the same route to work, and returned home to the same apartment where he would eat dinner in front of a television that he was not really watching. He was not depressed in a clinical sense. He was not unhappy in a way that made him reach out for help. He was simply existing at a low volume, and he had been doing it for so long that he had forgotten there was ever supposed to be a higher one. It was on a morning in early March when everything began to shift. Daniel was sitting at his desk at the firm, reviewing a routine financial report for a client whose name he had barely registered, when his phone rang. It was his younger sister, Maya, calling from Ohio. She never called during work hours. That alone made him pick up immediately. Maya's voice was calm but careful in the way that people are calm when they are holding something heavy and trying not to drop it. She told him that their father had suffered a heart attack the previous night and was in the hospital. He was stable, she said. The doctors were optimistic, but it was serious and she thought Daniel should come home. Daniel sat with the phone pressed to his ear for a long moment after the call ended. Around him, the office continued its normal rhythm. Keyboards clicked, printers hummed, and someone laughed at something near the coffee station. None of it registered. His mind had gone somewhere else entirely, to a house in Ohio, to a man he had never fully understood, to a lifetime of conversations that had never happened and questions that had never been asked. He requested the time off within the hour, packed a bag that evening, and booked the earliest train he could find. As he sat on the platform that night waiting for his departure, a strange feeling moved through him that he could not immediately identify. It was not grief exactly, and it was not fear, though both of those things were present. It was something older and quieter. It was the feeling of a door that had been shut for a very long time suddenly swinging open, and on the other side of it, a life he had not yet decided to live. The train ride from the city to Ohio took just under 4 hours, but for Daniel it felt much longer. He sat by the window with his bag on the seat beside him and watched the landscape change from dense urban blocks to open stretches of flat land dusted with the last of winter's frost. He had made this trip before, usually for holidays, usually with a gift bag in one hand and a rehearsed smile ready for the door. But this time was different. This time he was not going home to perform normalcy. He was going home because something real had happened, and he was not entirely sure he knew how to handle real anymore. He thought about his father during the ride. Gerald Carter was a man of few words and even fewer displays of warmth. He had worked most of his adult life in a factory that manufactured auto parts. And he carried the posture of that work even after he retired, a kind of permanent tension in the shoulders, a jaw that never fully relaxed. He was not a cruel man. He had never raised his hand to any of his children, never spoken to them with true contempt. But he had built a wall around himself so thick and so tall that none of them had ever really gotten through it. Daniel had stopped trying sometime in his teenage years, and by the time he left for college, the distance between father and son had become so familiar that neither of them thought to question it. What Daniel had never fully allowed himself to feel was how much that distance had cost him. It had been easier to file it away under the category of things that simply were, rather than things that hurt. But sitting on that train with nothing to distract him, no spreadsheet to review and no deadline to chase, the cost of that silence rose up inside him in a way he was not prepared for. He arrived at the station just past 9 in the evening and found Maya waiting for him near the entrance. She was 30 years old and had their mother's eyes and their father's stubborn jaw. And when she saw Daniel, she hugged him in the tight, wordless way of people who have grown up in the same household and know that some things do not need to be said out loud. They drove to the hospital mostly in silence, with only the radio filling the space between them, a low country song that neither of them was listening to. The hospital was quiet at that hour. The corridors were lit with the pale artificial light that makes every hospital feel like it exists slightly outside of time. And the smell of antiseptic and recycled air greeted Daniel the moment he stepped through the automatic doors. Maya led him to the cardiac unit on the 3rd floor, and as they walked, she filled him in on the details she had not included in the phone call. Their father had collapsed in the kitchen the previous morning. Their mother, Ruth, had called for an ambulance within minutes. The doctors had performed an emergency procedure to clear a blocked artery, and Gerald was now resting and recovering. But the cardiologist had been clear that without serious changes to his lifestyle, the risk of another event was high. Ruth was sitting in a chair just outside the room when they arrived. She was 62 years old and had spent 4 decades loving a man who did not always make it easy to love him, and yet there was something unbroken in her face that Daniel had always found both remarkable and quietly heartbreaking. She stood when she saw him and held his face in both hands for a moment before pulling him into a hug. She smelled like the same soap she had used his entire life, and that small familiar detail undid something in Daniel's chest that he had not known was knotted. She told him that Gerald was awake and had been asking about him. That surprised Daniel more than he expected. He had assumed his father would receive the news of his arrival with the same mild acknowledgement he received most things, a nod, perhaps a brief word of greeting. The idea that Gerald had been asking for him specifically sat in Daniel's mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. He stood outside the door for a moment before going in. Through the small rectangular window, he could see his father lying in the hospital bed with tubes attached to his arm and a monitor beside him tracking his heartbeat in steady green lines. Gerald looked smaller than Daniel remembered. Not just physically, though he had lost weight, and the hospital gown made him seem diminished in a way that his usual work clothes never had. He looked smaller in the way that powerful silences look small once they are broken, like something that had held great authority had suddenly been revealed as fragile. Daniel pushed the door open and stepped inside. Gerald turned his head slowly and looked at his son, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The monitor beeped softly in the background. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rattled past. And then Gerald did something that Daniel had seen perhaps a handful of times in his entire life. He lifted his hands slightly off the bed, not quite a wave, not quite a gesture of any kind, but an offering. A small, uncertain reaching out. Daniel walked to the chair beside the bed and sat down. He did not know what to say, and it seemed his father did not either. But for the first time in longer than either of them could probably remember, they were in the same room not out of obligation or holiday schedule, but because one of them needed the other and the other had come. That alone felt like the beginning of something, though neither man had the words for it yet. Daniel stayed until visiting hours ended, and when he finally walked out into the cool March night and stood in the hospital parking lot, he looked up at the sky for a long time. The stars were faint behind a thin layer of cloud, but they were there. And for a reason he could not fully explain, he was glad to see them. Daniel stayed in his childhood home that night, sleeping in his old bedroom which his mother had long since converted into a guest room with neutral curtains and a quilt she had sewn herself. The familiar bones of the space were still there. The same window that looked out onto the backyard maple tree. The same creak in the floorboard near the door, but everything else had been softened and rearranged into something more general, less his. He lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling for a long time before sleep finally came. He woke early the next morning to the smell of coffee and the sound of his mother moving quietly through the kitchen below. Ruth Carter was a woman who processed difficulty through action. When life pressed down on her, she cleaned, she cooked, she organized. It was her way of maintaining control over the small things when the large things felt unmanageable. By the time Daniel came downstairs, there was a full breakfast on the table, eggs and toast and sliced fruit arranged with a care that felt like a language of its own. They sat together at the kitchen table, mother and son, in the same chairs they had occupied for most of Daniel's childhood. Ruth wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and looked at him with the kind of steady, searching gaze that mothers reserve for the moments when they are trying to understand how their children are really doing beneath whatever surface they have chosen to present. She asked him how his life was going, not in a prodding way but in a genuine one, and Daniel found himself answering more honestly than he usually did. He told her that work was fine, that the city was fine, that everything was technically fine, but that he had been feeling for a while like he was standing just outside of his own life looking in through a window. He had not planned to say that. It came out before he could edit it, and once it was in the air between them, he felt both exposed and relieved. Ruth listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that stayed with Daniel for a long time afterward. She told him that his father had felt the same way for most of his adult life, that Gerald had spent decades standing outside of himself, never knowing how to step in, and that the tragedy of it was not just what it had cost Gerald, but what it had cost everyone around him. She did not say it with bitterness. She said it with the tired clarity of a woman who had made peace with a hard truth and was now simply reporting it. That morning visit to the hospital was different from the night before. Gerald was more alert, sitting up slightly in the bed, his color a little better. Maya came as well, and for a while the four of them occupied the room in a loose, careful way, talking about small things: the weather, a neighbor's recent renovation, a television program Ruth had been watching. It was surface conversation, but it was conversation. And in a family that had sometimes gone weeks without gathering in the same room, even surface felt like progress. At one point, Maya stepped out to take a phone call and Ruth went to speak with a nurse, and Daniel found himself alone with his father for the first time. The room felt quieter without the buffer of others. Gerald looked at his son for a moment and then looked at the window, as if the bare winter sky outside offered some kind of assistance. He spoke first, which surprised Daniel. Gerald said in his low, unhurried voice that he knew he had not been easy to know. He did not dress it up or reach for elaborate language. He said it plainly, the way a man says something he has been holding for a long time and has finally decided to put down. He said he was not sure he had ever known how to be the kind of father his children deserved, and that lying in a hospital bed had a way of making a man think about the things he had left undone. Daniel did not rush to reassure him. He did not say it was fine or that it did not matter, because neither of those things was entirely true, and some instinct told him that his father did not want comfort so much as he wanted honesty. So Daniel told him that it had been hard growing up feeling like there was a version of his father that existed just out of reach. He said it without anger, framing it as something that was simply true, a fact of his experience rather than an accusation. Gerald received it without flinching, which itself felt significant. What followed was not a dramatic reconciliation. There were no tears, no sweeping declarations, no resolution to years of emotional distance wrapped up neatly in a single conversation. What there was instead was something quieter and in many ways more meaningful. Two people, a father and a son, sitting in a hospital room and speaking to each other with a degree of honesty that they had never quite managed before. It was incomplete and imperfect and tinged with the awkwardness of people learning a new language mid-conversation. But it was real. When Ruth and Maya returned, the moment shifted back into the familiar rhythms of family small talk, and Daniel did not try to recapture it. He understood that what had passed between him and his father was delicate, and that delicate things needed room to breathe rather than to be examined too closely too soon. He drove back to the house that afternoon with Maya, and as they pulled into the driveway, she looked over at him and asked if he was okay. He thought about it for a genuine moment, which was itself unusual for him, and then he told her that he thought he might actually be better than okay. She did not ask him to explain. She simply nodded in the way that younger sisters nod when they understand more than they let on, and they went inside together to help their mother with dinner. Daniel had planned to stay for 3 days. He ended up staying for 7. It was not a decision he made consciously or announced formally. It simply happened the way certain important things happen, gradually and then all at once, each day offering a reason to remain that felt more pressing than any reason to leave. His supervisor had told him to take the time he needed, and for once in his adult life, Daniel took that permission seriously. The days settled into a gentle rhythm. Mornings at the kitchen table with Ruth, afternoons at the hospital with his father, evenings with Maya helping prepare dinner or sitting in the living room watching old recorded programs that none of them were particularly invested in, but all of them found quietly comforting. It was ordinary in the truest sense of the word, and yet Daniel felt more present during those 7 days than he had felt in years. There was something about being needed, genuinely needed, that had a way of pulling a person back into themselves. Gerald continued to improve steadily. By the 3rd day, he was sitting fully upright and speaking more freely, and by the 5th, the doctors were talking about a discharge timeline. The cardiologist came in one afternoon and spoke at length about dietary changes, a cardiac rehabilitation program, stress reduction, and the importance of regular follow-up appointments. Gerald listened with the same quiet attention he brought to most things. And when the doctor left, he looked at Ruth and said simply that he supposed he was going to have to learn some new habits. Ruth told him that she supposed he was. And there was something in the exchange, small and dry and intimate, that gave Daniel a glimpse of the private language his parents had developed over 40 years together. A language he had never been fully fluent in, but was only now beginning to understand. On the 4th evening, Daniel took a walk alone through the old neighborhood after dinner. It was cold but clear, and the streets were quiet in the particular way of residential neighborhoods in early March, before the warmth has returned and people have not yet begun spending time on porches and front lawns. He walked past his old elementary school, past the park where he and his childhood friends had spent entire summers, past the corner store that had changed ownership at least 3 times since he was a boy but still occupied the same faded brick building with the same flickering sign above the door. He had not allowed himself to feel nostalgic about this town in a long time. Nostalgia had always seemed to him like a trap, a way of anchoring yourself to a past that no longer existed and could not be recovered. But walking those streets in the cold evening air, he did not feel trapped. He felt something more like grief, a clean and honest grief for the years that had passed and the connections that had been allowed to thin, and alongside that grief, a faint but persistent sense of possibility that he could not entirely explain. He thought about what his mother had said at the kitchen table that first morning, about Gerald spending his life standing outside of himself. Daniel had been turning that image over in his mind ever since, because he recognized it so completely. He had used almost the same words himself when describing his own life to Ruth, and it had not occurred to him until that walk how significant that mirroring was. He had spent years quietly blaming his father for the emotional distance between them, framing Gerald as the source of a coldness that Daniel had simply inherited and carried forward. But standing on the corner of his old street in the night air, he saw it differently. The distance was not something his father had done to him. It was something both of them had learned, and learning implied the possibility of unlearning. He returned to the house that night with something shifted inside him. Not fixed, not resolved, but shifted, the way furniture looks different after you move it even slightly, catching light from a new angle. He sat with his mother for a while before bed, and she told him stories about his father as a young man, things Daniel had never known or thought to ask about. She told him that Gerald had grown up in a household even colder than the one he had created, raised by a father who communicated almost exclusively through silence and expectation. She told him that Gerald had genuinely tried to do better, that his effort had simply been invisible because he did not know how to make it visible, and that this was its own kind of tragedy. Daniel listened to all of it without rushing her or redirecting the conversation. He asked questions he had never thought to ask before about where his parents had met, what his father had been like when he was young, what their early years together had looked like before children and exhaustion, and the accumulated weight of adult life had settled over everything. Ruth answered with a warmth and a detail that told him she had been waiting a long time for someone to ask. On the 6th day, Gerald came home from the hospital. The discharge process took most of the morning, and by early afternoon he was settled in his armchair in the living room, looking both relieved and slightly diminished by the transition from medical supervision to domestic quiet. Maya had bought groceries in line with the new dietary guidelines, and Ruth had already begun researching heart-healthy recipes with the focused energy of a woman who had found her next project. That evening, after dinner, Daniel sat across from his father in the living room and they watched a documentary about the construction of a famous bridge. Neither of them had chosen it deliberately. It had simply been on, and neither of them had reached for the remote. They sat in silence for most of it, but it was a different silence than the ones Daniel had grown up inside. It was not the silence of two people who had nothing to say to each other. It was the silence of two people who had recently said something true and were allowing it to settle before saying anything more. When the program ended, Gerald looked over at Daniel and said that he was glad he had come. Daniel told him he was glad too, and meant it in a way that surprised him with its completeness. He had come because Maya had called, and because it had seemed like the right thing to do. He had not expected to leave with anything more than the quiet satisfaction of having shown up. But something had been returned to him during those days, something he had not known was missing. And as he sat in his father's living room in the lamplight, he could feel it settling back into place inside him like a key finding its lock. Daniel took the train back to the city on a Sunday morning 7 days after he had arrived. Ruth packed him a bag of food for the journey, more than he could possibly eat, and hugged him at the door for a long time without saying anything. Maya walked him to the car and told him not to wait for another emergency to come back, and the way she said it was gentle but direct. The tone of someone who had watched two people waste time and did not intend to watch it continue. Daniel told her he would come back in the spring, and he meant it, which was different from the many times he had said similar things and meant them only loosely. The landscape reversed itself on the return journey, open fields giving way to thickening skylines, the quiet of small-town Ohio dissolving gradually into the dense and indifferent energy of the city. Daniel sat with the food his mother had packed and watched it all pass by and felt something he had not felt on a Sunday in a very long time. He felt like he was returning to his life rather than simply resuming it. The distinction was small, but it was everything. Back in his apartment that evening, he stood in the center of his living room and looked at it as if seeing it for the first time. It was tidy and functional and almost entirely without personality, a space that had been lived in without ever being truly inhabited. The walls were bare, except for a single framed print he had bought years ago because it had seemed like the kind of thing a person should have on their wall. The shelves held books he had read once and never thought about again. The kitchen was clean in the way that kitchens are clean when they are not used very much. He had been living in this apartment for 4 years, and he had never once made it feel like home, because somewhere underneath the practicality he had built his life around, he had never quite believed he was staying. He did not make any dramatic changes that night. He did not rearrange the furniture or throw things away or make a list of resolutions. He simply sat down on the couch and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what the past week had given him and what it had asked of him in return. It had asked him to be present. It had asked him to be honest. It had asked him to sit in rooms with people he loved and actually look at them rather than performing the act of looking. And it had shown him, quietly and without fanfare, that he was capable of all of those things. In the weeks that followed, Daniel began making changes that were small individually but significant in their accumulation. He called his mother every few days, not out of obligation, but because he found he genuinely wanted to know how she was doing and how his father's recovery was progressing. Gerald had begun the cardiac rehabilitation program and was attending 3 sessions a week, which Ruth reported with a pride she tried to keep measured but could not quite contain. Daniel spoke to his father briefly on some of those calls, short conversations about unremarkable things, but conversations nonetheless, and each one felt like a small deposit into an account that had been overdrawn for most of his life. He began paying attention to his days in a way he had not before. Not in the anxious, audit-like way of someone trying to optimize their time, but in the quieter way of someone who has remembered that time is finite and has decided to be more deliberate about where it goes. He started cooking real meals instead of assembling whatever required the least effort. He reached out to a friend he had been meaning to see for months, and they met for dinner and talked for 3 hours, and he left feeling more like himself than he had in longer than he could pin down. He bought a plant for his apartment, a small and undemanding one, and put it on the windowsill where it could get the afternoon light. None of these things were revolutionary. He was not reborn in any cinematic sense. He did not quit his job or move across the country or fall into a sudden and transformative love. His life, from the outside, probably looked much the same as it always had. But the interior of it had shifted in a way that mattered more than any external change could have captured. He had stopped living at a low volume and had reached, tentatively but with genuine intention, for something louder. He visited Ohio in April, as he had promised Maya he would. The maple tree in the backyard had come into leaf, and his father was sitting in a lawn chair on the back porch when Daniel arrived, getting some of the afternoon sun the way the doctor had encouraged. Gerald looked better than he had in the hospital, more solid somehow, more present. They sat together on the porch for a while and talked about the garden, about a book Gerald had recently started reading for the first time in years, about a neighbor's dog that had developed a habit of escaping its yard and appearing in unexpected places around the block. It was not a profound conversation. It did not reach the depths of what had passed between them in the hospital room, and it did not need to. What it was easy, and ease between them was something so new that Daniel could feel it consciously, the way you feel the absence of a tension you had been carrying so long you forgot it was there. They were not the same people they had been before that phone call in March. They were not suddenly a different kind of father and son than the one life had made them. But they were trying, both of them, in the small and consistent and unglamorous way that real trying actually looks, and that was more than Daniel had believed possible for most of his adult life. On the drive back to the train station, Maya asked him how he was feeling and he told her he was feeling like himself, which was true, though what he meant by it was more layered than it sounded. He meant that he had spent years wearing a version of himself that fit well enough but was never quite right, and that something about the past several weeks had helped him find the original again. She smiled at that and told him it showed, and coming from Maya, who had always been the most perceptive person in the family, it meant something. He boarded the train as the late afternoon sun stretched long and golden across the platform, and as the city began to pull him back into its familiar gravity, Daniel Carter felt something he had quietly stopped expecting to feel. He felt like whatever came next, he was ready for it, not because everything had been resolved or repaired or made perfect, but because he had remembered after a very long time that he was someone worth showing up for. And that in the end had made all the difference. Like, share, and subscribe, don't miss it.